My father insists that I hand over my paycheck to him, promising to share it with me if I behave well with his new family. Yet, he seems to have forgotten who actually owns the house we live in, which means he and his wife, who contributes little, will need to find somewhere else to stay. I never expected to receive that call during Professor Martinez's economics lecture. The sudden vibration of my phone startled me, and when I saw my father's name flash across the screen, my heart sank. My mother had been battling pancreatic cancer for months, and deep down, I sensed that this call would not bring good news. "Ethan," my father's voice trembled, "your mother, she's gone." The lecture hall suddenly felt suffocating, too small and crowded. At 21, I thought I was ready for this moment. My mother and I had discussed it during my last visit home when the doctor had told us the treatment was no longer effective. She had squeezed my hand and reassured me, "My brave boy, you'll be okay." But nothing truly prepares you for the loss of a parent. I had always been my mother's little boy. She taught me how to ride a bike, helped me with my math homework, and later drove me to college tours. My father, on the other hand, was more of a free spirit, never holding a steady job and preferring to focus on his various hobbies and social activities. My mother didn't mind, her job as a financial advisor provided well for us, and she loved seeing my father happy. After getting permission from the dean's office to take time off, I booked the first available train home. The 3-hour journey gave me time to reflect on the past few months. My mother had been so methodical about everything, even her illness. She made sure I visited regularly, had long conversations with me about the future, and kept reminding me how proud she was of my decision to study business administration. When I arrived at our 2-story suburban home, my father was waiting at the door, mascara streaking down his face. He pulled me into a tight embrace, his designer shirt damp with tears. "Oh, Ethan, what am I going to do? This house, all the bills. I haven't worked in 20 years. I guided him to the kitchen, noticing a half-empty wineglass on the counter. "Dad, we need to focus on the funeral arrangements first. Did Mom leave any instructions?" He waved vaguely toward her home office. "Everything's in her desk. She was always so organized." He reached for the wineglass. The next few days became a blur of funeral preparations. My father seemed unable to handle any decisions, dissolving into tears whenever I asked for his opinion on flowers or the service program. I found myself coordinating with the funeral home, calling relatives, and handling all the arrangements while he calmed his nerves with more wine. The morning of the funeral arrived, clear and crisp. People filled our house, offering condolences and bringing casseroles. My father put on quite a show, dramatically breaking down several times during the service. I noticed his friend Samuel patting his back, whispering something in his ear that made my father nod vigorously. "Your mother was such a wonderful woman," relatives kept telling me. "She always thought ahead, always took care of her family." I smiled politely, holding myself together. My mother wouldn't have wanted me to fall apart, she had raised me to be stronger than that. Still, as I watched them lower her casket into the ground, I couldn't help but wonder what changes this loss would bring to our lives. A week after the funeral, my father and I sat in Mrs. Peterson's law office for the reading of my mother's will. He kept fidgeting with his pearl cufflinks, a gift from my mother for their 20th anniversary. Mrs. Peterson adjusted her glasses and began reading in her precise, measured voice. "Being of sound mind and body, I, Roberta Jane Harrison, declare this to be my last will and testament." I listened carefully as she outlined the details. When she got to the main provisions, my father's fidgeting stopped abruptly. "To my beloved son, Ethan Harrison, I leave our family home along with a sum of $200,000. My father's head snapped up, and I could feel the tension radiating from him. "To my husband, Christopher Harrison, I leave a monthly allowance of $1,500 to be paid from my retirement fund." "That's it," my father's voice cracked. "I'm her husband. 23 years of marriage, and this is what I get?" Mrs. Peterson's tone was gentle but firm. "Your wife carefully considered these arrangements. The will is properly executed and legally binding. It would be best to accept her decision." My father muttered something under his breath, his fingers twisting his cufflinks so tightly that I worried they might break. Home was filled with memories of past Christmases. From the train station, I took a taxi, watching familiar streets pass by. I used my key to quietly open the front door, planning to surprise my father. The house smelled of cinnamon and coffee, at least that hadn't changed. But then I heard laughter coming from the living room, a voice I recognized as my father's, accompanied by a woman's voice I didn't know. I stepped into the doorway and froze. My father was sitting on our couch next to a woman who looked to be about 5 years younger than him, wearing an artsy scarf and holding his hand. They were sitting close together, laughing about something, looking completely at ease with one another. "Ethan!" Dad jumped slightly when he saw me. "I wasn't expecting you." "Obviously," I replied, still standing in the doorway. "I thought I'd surprise you for Christmas, since we always spend it together as a family." An awkward silence filled the room. The woman stood up, and I noticed she was wearing my mother's slippers. "Honey," Dad said, his voice unnaturally high, "I'd like you to meet Jamie." He paused, glancing between us. "My wife. We got married 3 months ago." I must have misheard. "I'm sorry, did you say wife? As in married?" "Yes, sweetie. We met in my art class. Remember the one I told you about? Jamie is an artist too. We just connected." He spoke in that condescending tone he always used, the one that drove me crazy. 3 months ago? I did the math in my head. Mom's only been gone for 7 months. 8 months, he corrected quickly. "And Ethan, when you find love again, you just know. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to disturb your studies. You've been so busy with school." I looked around the room, really seeing it for the first time. Mom's favorite reading chair was gone, replaced by a modern piece that didn't match anything else. There were new paintings on the walls, abstract splashes of color that Dad would have hated 6 months ago. And there, on the mantel where Mom's family photos used to be, was a large wedding picture of Dad and this Jamie person. "You moved her into my house without asking me?" The words slipped out before I could stop them. Dad's face tightened. "Ethan, this is my home too. You said so yourself, right?" I took a deep breath, trying to channel my mother's calm approach to difficult situations. "Well, I guess we should get to know each other then. Jamie, what do you do for work?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, you know how it is these days, the economy, the job market." She launched into a story about her last gallery showing, then somehow segued into a funny story about Dad's painting technique, making him giggle like a teenager. I tried again. "But what's your current job?" Her smile faltered slightly. "Well, I'm between positions at the moment, looking for the right opportunity, something that really speaks to my creative spirit." "She's an artist, Ethan," Dad jumped in defensively. "She can't be confined by some corporate 9-to-5 job. Her last boss just couldn't understand her vision. Some people are too conventional to appreciate true creativity." Christmas morning arrived, and I woke up to the sound of clattering dishes downstairs. Following the noise to the kitchen, I found Dad setting out our best china, the set Mom had given him for their 20th anniversary, and arranging far more place settings than usual. "Dad, are we expecting company?" I asked, picking up a coffee mug from the cabinet. He barely looked up from his work. "Oh yes, Jamie's family is coming over for Christmas dinner. They're such lovely people, Ethan. You'll see." "What about the Andersons?" I asked. Mom's sister, Sarah, and her family had spent every Christmas with us for as long as I could remember, along with Uncle Mike and Aunt Jenny. Dad's hands paused briefly over the silverware. "Ethan, things are different now. I need to build relationships with Jamie's family. They're part of our lives now." Before I could respond, the doorbell rang. Dad hurried to answer it, leaving me alone in the kitchen with the ghost of Christmas past. Jamie's family arrived in a noisy cluster, her parents, who looked around the house with appraising eyes, and her sister Rachel with her husband and 2 kids. They burst in like they owned the place, immediately spreading out to explore. During dinner, Dad kept shooting me worried glances as Jamie's family dominated the conversation. Her father complained about property taxes taught me they were Jamie's family, and they seemed intent on taking over my house as if they already owned it. Your house, he laughed bitterly. This was our family home long before your mother decided to play favorites in her will. I did the right thing, I said firmly. And if you can't see that, then maybe Mom was right about everything. The rest of my holiday visit passed in icy silence. Dad and Jamie disappeared into their room whenever I was around. I spent most of my time visiting Mom's family. Aunt Sarah cried when she heard they'd excluded her from Christmas dinner, and Uncle Mike just shook his head sadly, saying, "Your mother would be heartbroken to see this." When I returned to college, I thought the distance might help heal things. I was wrong. Dad's calls started coming again, but they were different now. He barely asked about my classes or my life. Instead, every conversation returned to money. "Jamie and I are struggling, Ethan," he said during one call. "The monthly allowance barely covers anything these days. We need help." "Dad, maybe it's time for both of you to look for jobs," I suggested gently. The line went quiet for a moment. "How dare you," he finally hissed. "I'm your father. I raised you, and now you're acting like some cruel, heartless stranger." The call ended with a click. An hour later, my phone buzzed with a message from him, a photo of an empty refrigerator followed by dramatic text, "When we starve to death, it will be on your conscience." I stared at the message for a long time, remembering how Dad used to guilt-trip Mom the same way when he wanted something. She usually gave in, saying it was easier than fighting. Despite knowing better, I found myself transferring money from Mom's account to his. It became a pattern: his dramatic pleas, my reluctant transfers, his temporary gratitude followed by more demands. The next few months passed this way, with Dad and Jamie living in my house while I finished college. They didn't attend my graduation ceremony, sending a text about being too busy with some art exhibition. I knew it was because I had stopped sending extra money the month before, tired of enabling their lifestyle. After graduation, I decided to return home. When I told Dad my plans, his response was lukewarm at best. "Oh, you're moving back," he said, his voice flat. "Well, I suppose it is your house." The way he emphasized "your house" reminded me of Rachel's tone that Christmas Day. Finding a job didn't take long. Mom's old connections in the financial sector helped me land a position at Anderson & Mills Financial Services. I threw myself into the work, grateful for the distraction from the increasingly tense situation at home. Meanwhile, Dad and Jamie settled into a routine of their own, one that didn't involve working. Dad still received his monthly allowance of $1,500 from Mom's retirement fund, but he spent most of it entertaining Jamie's family. Every weekend brought another artistic gathering or dinner party, with Jamie's relatives sprawled across our living room, drinking wine and critiquing each other's artwork. I started noticing the bills piling up. The utilities had doubled since I'd been away at college. Apparently, creative spirits needed a lot of heat and hot water. The grocery bills were astronomical, thanks to Dad's frequent parties, and somehow I had become responsible for all of it. Every time I came home from grocery shopping, half the food would disappear into one of their parties. I'd find empty wine bottles in the recycling bin and hear Jamie's sister Rachel laughing in the kitchen, helping herself to the snacks I bought for my work lunches. "Your father is so generous," I overheard Rachel say one evening, "unlike some people in this house." The breaking point came after 3 months of this arrangement. I had just finished paying the property taxes, which Dad had forgotten to mention were due, when he cornered me in the kitchen. "Ethan, we need to have a serious conversation." "Actually, Dad, I've been wanting to talk to you too," I started, but he cut me off, his face set in that familiar expression he used to have when demanding something from Mom. "Marcus told me something interesting today. His son, Julian, works in your department." My stomach dropped. Julian, the office gossip. "Of course he says you're making $4,600 a month," Dad continued, his eyes narrowing. "And yet look how you're treating your family. The bare minimum on groceries, complaining about every little bill, making Jamie feel guilty about her art supplies. You're being selfish and greedy, just like your mother accused me of being all those years." I stared at him, shocked by the bitterness in his voice. "So here's what's going to happen," he continued, sounding eerily calm. $200,000, and you're too selfish to share with your own father?" I felt a headache building behind my eyes. We'll talk about this tomorrow, I said, turning to leave. When you're thinking more clearly. The next morning, I came down to breakfast to find Dad and Jamie sitting at the table, looking like cats who had caught a canary. The kitchen smelled of coffee and manipulation. Ethan, dear, Dad began, his voice honey-sweet. Jamie and I had a long talk last night. Jamie nodded sagely beside him, wearing another one of the expensive sweaters I had essentially paid for. We've come up with the perfect solution, he continued. Since we take such good care of the house, cleaning, cooking, maintaining everything, it's only fair that you pay us for our services. Jamie smiled benevolently. We think your full salary, the $4,600, would be fair compensation. I took a long sip of coffee, letting the absurdity of their proposal sink in. The house they claimed to maintain had dust bunnies the size of actual bunnies. The last time Dad had cooked was probably before he met Jamie, and maintenance? They called me every time a light bulb needed changing. You know what? I said slowly. You're right. Services should be paid for. Their faces lit up like Christmas trees. Dad reached for Jamie's hand, squeezing it triumphantly. But I continued, I won't be requiring your services anymore, especially since there haven't actually been any services to speak of unless you count drinking wine and hosting parties as household maintenance. The smiles froze on their faces. In fact, I stood up from the table, surprising myself with how calm I felt. I want you both out of my house. You have 7 days to find a new place to live, or I'll be contacting a lawyer about formal eviction proceedings. The color drained from Dad's face as he realized I was serious. He leapt up from his chair, grabbing one of Mom's old plates from the table. You ungrateful little. Break it, I said coldly, and I'll deduct it from your next allowance check, along with anything else you damaged during your tantrum. Dad's hand shook, but he didn't drop the plate. I turned and walked upstairs to my room. Behind me, I could hear Dad's screams turning to sobs, Jamie's attempts at consolation, and the sound of things being knocked around in the kitchen. But for the first time since Mom died, I felt like I was doing exactly what she would have wanted me to do. A soft knock on my bedroom door came a few hours later. Ethan, sweetie, Dad's voice had shifted back to its sugary sweet tone. Can we talk? I opened the door but stayed in the doorway, blocking his entrance into my space. He had fixed his makeup and put on the sweater he used to wear when trying to convince Mom to buy him something expensive. I was just joking about the money, he said, attempting a light laugh. We don't need your salary. Jamie and I just want to keep living here with you. We're family, after all. No, Dad, I replied, feeling suddenly tired. I've made my decision. You need to find your own place to live. For the next few days, he tried every manipulation tactic in his playbook. He left tearful notes under my door, sent Jamie to plead their case, claiming they'd change. He even tried guilt-tripping me with more photos of empty cupboards and unpaid bills. I stopped eating meals with them, ordering takeout to my room instead. The sound of their voices downstairs, alternating between arguing and planning their next move, became background noise to my new reality. A week later, I came home from work to find them packing. Dad was dramatically throwing things into boxes, making sure I could hear every item hit the cardboard. I hope you're happy, he spat when he saw me. Throwing your own father out on the street. Jamie stood behind him, arms crossed. Some son you turned out to be. They left that evening in a flurry of curse words and slammed doors. As their car pulled away, I walked through the house that was finally truly mine. Over the next few weeks, news trickled in through the family grapevine. Aunt Sarah called to tell me Dad was bad-mouthing me to anyone who would listen, claiming I had cruelly evicted him out of pure spite. But don't you worry, Sarah assured me. We all remember how he treated your mother. Nobody's buying his victim act this time. Uncle Mike told me that Dad and Jamie had tried moving in with Rachel, the same sister who wanted to take over my house at Christmas. She turned them down flat. He chuckled, suddenly their perfect new family isn't so perfect anymore.